series beginning from last year during the COVID lockdown. We've continued to have this webinar series over the months. We've had different people come on this platform, different activists, academics, students, all over the world to come and speak about different issues on this webinar series. And today we have another guest, Comrade Terry Crawford Brown, on this webinar series, and we'll be discussing the illegal arms trade and Israel, a very fascinating subject matter. Comrade Terry, thank you for joining us, and how are you feeling today?
Thank you for the invitation. I'm well. So yes, thank you very much for the invitation to speak.
Oh, wonderful. It's our pleasure. Comrade Terry, let's get right into it. So just briefly tell us about yourself and how you got involved with Palestine Solidarity.
Yeah. I was actually born in Ireland, but I left there as a baby, and I grew up in Tripoli, Libya, until I was 17. As you may know, Libya was an Italian colony prior to the Second World War, and at the end of the war, the British took over administration of 2/3 of it on behalf of the United Nations until the United Nations in 1951 decided that Libya should become independent. My father's job was to put back and restore the economy that has been very, very badly damaged during the war, and until Libya became independent. And my first recollection really is 1948, when Israel became independent, declared its independence, and we had very severe riots in Tripoli. About 20% of the population of Tripoli was Jewish, and synagogues were burned down, and I think several hundred people were killed. And it is now increasingly being researched that those riots, not only in Tripoli, but also in Iran and Iraq and Morocco, were actually instigated by underground Zionist operators to terrify the Arab Jewish population into immigrating to Israel. And of course, they were promised all kinds of things once they got to the promised land. Once they got there, they found they were cannon fodder for the army and farm laborers on the lands that had been stolen from the Palestinians. So immediately they became part of the economic underclass. And that continues even today. So more than 50% of the Israeli Jewish population is actually, they call them the Mizrahim, but they are actually Arab Jews. And they are one of the underclasses in Israel. Now, one of those, as an example, was Mordecai Vanunu, who was born in Morocco and went to Israel as a child. And in due course, he became the whistleblower on the Israeli nuclear weapons program in 1986. He fled the country and was in England and was then kidnapped by the Mossad from Italy, taken back to Israel and put on trial and sentenced to 18 years in jail, mainly in solitary confinement. And when eventually he was released, he was not allowed to leave the country. And that is still the case even today. The suppression of anyone who exposes anything to do with the Israeli armaments industry. The arms industry, because it's considered to be national security, has until now been beyond criticism in Israel, but it has been encouraged for a variety of reasons, including money-making. And so there are more and more exposés about the scandals involved with the Israeli arms trade, and that it is essentially without legislation or control. It's free, and Israel has used it to arm dictatorships around the world, in Myanmar, for instance, throughout Africa. And the quid pro quo is that Israelis, like, for instance, Dan Gertler in the Congo, then plunders the economic resources of that country. So we have the Congo, for instance, where 5 to 10 million people have died in what is known as Africa's First World War. Much of it is driven by the grab for natural resources wanted by, and it's known as Africa's First World War because it's essentially a grab for natural resources wanted by the First World War industry.
Yes. Thank you for that commentary. Just give us a brief overview of what is an illegal arms trade. You've written many books over the years. You've published a lot of literature over the years. Just for our audience who are not familiar with this particular subject, what is an illegal arms trade?
Well, in 1977, the UN Security Council decided that apartheid in South Africa and human rights abuses were a threat to international peace, and they imposed an arms embargo against apartheid South Africa for human rights issues. Israel was one of the countries that violated the arms embargo, but until the 90s, few people actually questioned the armaments industry. National security was something for the military and the politicians, and how dare civil society ever question it. But with our transition in South Africa in 1994, we then civil society here started to question the role of the military during the apartheid era, the huge amount of money that had been spent, the corruption involved, and coming out of that, well, just 3 months after the transition, Armscor was caught exporting AK-47s to Yemen, which was then under a UN arms embargo. And President Mandela appointed the Cameron Commission of Inquiry to investigate Armscor. And coming out of that was the National Conventional Arms Control Committee. Now, the legislation for that says that South Africa will not export armaments to countries that abuse human rights, to regions in conflict, to countries with a UN arms embargo. And so that is possibly one of the leading examples of where we say we will not export weapons to countries that abuse human rights. Unfortunately, right through its history, it has never been enforced properly. So we have good legislation, but we don't apply
it. So it is primarily the sale of weapons to countries that are under an embargo by the United Nations.
Yes, that's the main one, but there are other, it's also, for instance, in our case, the National Conventional Arms Control Committee should make a judgment call that exporting weapons to Yemen or to Saudi Arabia or to UAE, those are countries with horrendous human rights abuses, should be prohibited. Another one is to Turkey, where Turkey is involved in suppressing the Kurdish population. And just in April, May last year, during the COVID lockdown, 6 flights of Turkish air freighters arrived at Cape Town Airport to uplift munitions made in Somerset West by Rheinmetall Denel. They were flown off to Turkey, and a few weeks later, Turkey intervened in Libya. We don't know to the extent, because we've been asking for an investigation into this, still no investigation. Those weapons could have been used in Libya. They could then have been used against the Kurds, or perhaps even by supplying the weapons to Azerbaijan for the war against Armenia. So the arms industry is notorious for corruption. It's possibly the most corrupt industry in the world. And the CIA, of all people, have estimated that between 40 and 45% of global corruption relates to the arms trade. It's a business out of control.
And going to the crux of today's webinar commentary, where do we locate Israel in this global illegal trade of arms?
As a proportion of its economy, it's the highest in the world. It's now the 6th or 7th largest arms company, arms exporting country in the world. A lot of that is technology supplied from the United States, where they're quite blatant about how their exports are battle tested and proven against Palestinians. So this becomes part of their marketing ploy. And they are exporting virtually everywhere in the world without any regulation from the Israeli government. And just recently, thanks to some very courageous Israeli human rights activists and lawyers, they have been exposing how Israel has been exporting weapons to Myanmar, to the military dictatorship there. That finally has embarrassed the Israeli government, but there's a lot more exports to Uganda, and a report has just come out a week or 10 days ago from the American Friends Society, the Quakers in Jerusalem, about the extent of this Israeli arms exports. And just today, there is a report that at least 20 Israeli arms traders have been arrested by the Israeli government, presumably under pressure from the United States, because they've been exporting drones to China. So we see if there's at last some reaction internationally, even from the Americans.
And not only, it's very important that you mention the issue of technology. I mean, we've just seen the murder of the journalist Khashoggi by the Saudi Arabian regime.
Yes. And
there's been some reports also that some certain African countries are getting technology to spy and to also to run surveillance on human rights activists using Israeli technology. That is, do we see the rise of this illegal type of trade with Israeli arms companies to countries that are problematic? Are we seeing that rise?
It's a huge part of the trade, but ironically, a lot of it actually originated in South Africa during the 1970s and 80s, when Israel was flouting the UN arms embargo. Israel was going through very difficult economic times at that time, and the apartheid government thought it had gold, it had lots of money, and so essentially Israel had the technology and South Africa had the money, and South Africa funded the development of this security technology, including drones and missile technology and so forth. So a lot of it actually was developed in conjunction with the apartheid government. It was only in 1991 when the Americans began to put the pressure on the Israelis to withdraw from that alliance with apartheid South Africa that they began to back off. But now they're exporting weapons virtually everywhere in the world, and particularly the security technology, the spying technology used, for instance, against with Khashoggi and other Saudi Arabian dissidents. But I'm afraid South Africa in the 70s and 80s was very much part of that. And a lot of it was also encouraged by the CIA, the Americans, through a company called International Signal Corporation that was working very closely with Armscor.
And commentary, we cannot separate perhaps what you would call private arms dealers from the state of Israel, similar to how you could have not during apartheid in South Africa, separated the state from private entities that are selling arms. We know that they're enabled by the Israeli state. So even the arrest of the few that you just mentioned, it's a cosmetic practice from the state of Israel.
As we know, Israel is a highly militarized society, and every Israeli citizen is obliged to do national service. But what typically happens is that those who stay in the army and making an army career retire at, say, 40, and then they use their military connections to become arms traders internationally. So there is a large contingent of ex-army personnel who are involved in the arms trade.
We saw recently with the killing of Muslims in Myanmar, an ethnic cleansing project in our modern days. There was a contingent, of course, of Myanmar's military leaders who went to Israel, even during that crisis, not a crisis, a genocide, that ethnic cleansing, even during that time, Israel, the state of Israel had no shame, with rubbing shoulders with the military operatives of Myanmar. But my question is, how do we hold Israel accountable?
Well, up until now, they've been out of control. They have thought that and they've dressed it up as national security, and therefore national security trumps everything. Irrespective of what devastation, corruption it unleashes in, for instance, the DRC, if it's to the economic or other benefit of Israel, or providing Israel with political advantages in, for instance, Uganda or Rwanda, they will close their eyes to any of the human rights abuses that flow from their weapons. It's all part of promoting Israel's involvement internationally. And in addition to that, they use their repression of Palestinians to promote, for instance, in Brazil or the United States, how they deal with Palestinians. So, for instance, in Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo, or in about 100 cities in the United States, the police forces there have been trained by the Israelis in how to deal with Palestinians. And we've seen it, for instance, with the riots in the United States this last year, with the Black Lives Matter movement, the way that George Floyd was killed. So it's a highly, highly militarized police service, as well as military, that is, up until now, because of the abuse of the United States, by the United States, of its veto rights in the UN Security Council, no one's been able to do anything about it. The UN Human Rights Council have done lots of studies about it in Israel, but it gets vetoed by the United States. Maybe the embarrassment is beginning to come through because of this exports of drones to China. It's very early days to see whether that's the case. But as for instance, with apartheid South Africa, when finally we were overcoming the apartheid system, people like the Israelis and the Americans and the others who were involved in flouting the UN arms embargo suddenly wanted all of that to be forgotten.
And commentary, you mentioned United States a lot. We know this even from our own history in apartheid South Africa, that for a state, for a government to continue oppressing others, is enabled, and in many cases collaborates with other governments. The so-called big countries are enablers, and they are collaborators with Israel in this global corrupt arms trade. Recently, there's been an expose that the British government and even the British royal family is involved in this. Do you want to touch on that for us?
Well, after the Second World War, what started off as the Atlantic Alliance became the Five Eyes Alliance of 5 English-speaking white countries: the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, that come together for security purposes, and Israel de facto is a member of that they believe they have the right to intervene virtually anywhere in the world, and have done so, as we've seen since 9/11 and the war against Iraq and the war throughout the Middle East. The Five Eyes Alliance thinks they can intervene in terms of whatever excuse they create at the time. And Israel is very much part of that. They do the dirty work on behalf of the Five Eyes Alliance. And of course, those major countries dominate the arms trade, particularly the United States. And the corruption goes right to the top. For instance, the British royal family are deeply involved. Almost all members of the US Congress are involved, and it's all dressed up of keeping America safe, so that no congressperson has the political courage to say, what about a reduction in military spending? The world is currently spending, call it $2 trillion a year, most of it by the United States and NATO. And a fraction of that could really deal with so many of the problems that we face, from climate change to poverty to refugees. But and the Americans have lost almost every war they've fought since the Second World War, in Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq, etc. But they really don't care, as long as the money goes back to the arms dealers and the banks and others that are part of the military-industrial congressional complex, of which President Eisenhower warned in 1961 would come back to bite the Americans. And I think this is now happening, as we saw, for instance, on January the 6th, with the insurrection in the Capitol in the States. So the states, the middle class and the working class have become increasingly impoverished, and they're understandably angry. But that anger is expressed in such things as the insurrection. So the destabilization that the Americans and the British have inflicted on the rest of the world is now coming back to the States. Now, there's a very important aspect to this, that the world is essentially on a US dollar standard by way of the Saudi oil revenues. And after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Henry Kissinger negotiated with the Saudis that Britain and the United States would defend the Saudi royal family against domestic insurrection. And as we know, Saudi Arabia is possibly the worst human rights abuser in the world. But the other provisions of that are that all OPEC oil exports must be priced in US dollars only. This is what enables the US to fund its huge military spending and to fund about 1,000 military bases around the world, the purpose of which is to maintain American military and financial hegemony. So the world is no longer on a gold standard, it's on essentially a Saudi black gold standard of Saudi oil, okay? And so if anyone like Muammar Gaddafi or Hugo Chavez or Saddam Hussein start saying they want payment in euros or in gold, the next thing we have is regime change. So that's the background to the antagonism at the moment between Iran and the United States, or Venezuela and the United States, because they're refusing to toe the American line. That is beginning to come under threat, because the Americans are no longer dependent on importing oil from the Middle East, and China is now the largest customer, and it's refusing to pay in dollars. So that opens up the question as to how much longer the US dollar will be the world's reserve currency. And at the moment, we're in huge financial turmoil. It's been papered over after the 2008 financial crash, but now with COVID and the financial circumstances at the moment, it looks as though we're in for a huge financial chaos, and who knows what will actually come out of it. But it's very unlikely that China is going to continue to prop up the US dollar. They are by far the largest holders of US Treasury bills, by which, again, the US funds its bases around the world and imposes its militarization.
Karachi, just to wrap up a bit. So we've established that the United States, Britain, Canada, like you said, and other white English-speaking countries are out of control in the arms trade. How do we get to punish those who buy the arms? How do we punish, let's say, Myanmar's government that buy these arms? How do we punish government of Uganda that buys these arms?
Well, let's start at home in South Africa. Rheinmetall Denel Munitions, which is based here in Cape Town, it has been exporting weapons primarily to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and those weapons have been used in Yemen. And in fact, in 2016, President Zuma went to Saudi Arabia to open an ammunition factory in conjunction with Mohammed bin Salman. So we're also very complicit. But with the murder of Khashoggi, this has caused a huge amount of embarrassment, not only here, but in Germany and in England and in France, as to why they are associated with Saudi Arabia, and now in the United States, even Biden is posing questions as whether they're going to step back from this relationship with Saudi Arabia. We don't yet know whether the arms industry will have sufficient clout to get the Biden administration to reverse, but at the moment they're saying they're going to stop exporting to Saudi Arabia and to the UAE. And that could have massive implications worldwide, but also on Israel. If the United States begins to pull back from the Middle East, the Israelis, I believe, are going to have to reassess the whole situation vis-a-vis Palestine. The two-state solution is now a non-starter, and Israel is increasingly exposed as being a colonial state in the Arab world. So there are lots of things that may actually flow out of this. But yes, a lot is coming out of the murder of Khashoggi in 2018.
All right. Commentary, thank you very much for joining us today. I thank you very much for that comprehensive explanation of the arms trade. I think I had an idea of how it worked when I saw it in the movies, but I never really knew it was a well-coordinated, corrupt global network. So thank you very much for that input, and we really appreciate it. So again, thank you very much for honoring the invitation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Good night, commentary.
Okay, good night.